Thank you for joining our Open Cybersecurity Alliance Indicators of Behavior panel discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few items. This session will be recorded and available after the event. The Open Cybersecurity Alliance will be hosting a breakfast at the upcoming RSA conference, so please keep an eye out for more information or contact us for further details. And if time permits, the speakers will take some questions from the audience at the end of the program. Please submit your questions using the Q&A option in your menu bar. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today, so I'll turn it over to Harley for introductions.
All right. Thanks, Jane. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Harley Parks from the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. I'm over the last several years at APL, I've been leading the integrated adaptive cyber defense work at APL, which has really been focused on applying security automation and automated information sharing to help improve our cyber defense posture. So with me on the panel today, we have, I'll start with my colleague at APL, Charlie Frick. Charlie is a principal professional staff member at APL, and he also serves as the Open Cybersecurity Alliance Indicators of Behavior Sub-Project Chair. Along with Charlie, we have Jason Kierstead, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Threat Management for IBM Security, and he is the OCA co-chair. And we also have Carter Bullard, who is the Director of Cybersecurity for NEA Systems Division, a division of ARA, and Carter is a technical committee member on the IOB sub-project. So good morning, gentlemen, and thanks for participating today.
Thank you for having us.
All right. So we're going to jump kind of right into the questions we have and right into our topic on indicators of behavior today. And I tend to like to start to focus these discussions by really thinking about the problem that we're trying to solve. So I'm going to ask each of you maybe to chime in with your thoughts. Jason, maybe we'll start with you as kind of working on some of that threat intelligence space. What are kind of the shortfalls that you see in the current way we're doing and sharing cyber threat intelligence?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'd say if we're looking at, what are the shortfalls, to answer that question, you got to kind of look at what's the current state of affairs of sharing cyber threat intel. And, when we look at, we've come a long ways over the past 4 or 5 years around getting more alignment and standardization about best practices of how organizations should share that intelligence. Mainly via the Sticks and Taxis standard, sometimes also via a few proprietary protocols, but there's a lot better sharing going on of threat intel than there used to be. And I'd like to think a lot of that work actually is from some of the efforts that were put in the CTITC to create that Sticks and Taxis standard. But what we've seen, is the threat actors and the analytics that we need to detect those have gotten more and more advanced. And the classical method of sharing IOCs or indicators of compromise via methods like Sticks and Taxi, it's just no longer sufficient. And what we're trying to do is, there's a wide recognition in industry about moving more towards indicators of attack or indicators of behavior in terms of our analytics and being able to essentially share the complete chain of TTPs that a threat actor or threat actor group is trying to execute on your system in order to achieve their objective, be that, persistence or exfiltration, et cetera. But Sticks and Taxi, while it has some of the fundamental objects and methods required to encode some of that, it doesn't necessarily have all of them. And what we don't have is kind of a best practice and set of procedures around, if you want to share this information, how do you collaborate? How do you share it from one group to another, from one tool to another, to enable us as an industry to collectively collaborate around these indicators of behavior packages? because, I'm a very strong advocate that we need to, collaborate a lot more in the industry. So if you want to enable that collaboration, sharing that higher level tactical threat intelligence and make it operational, you need an agreed upon way that says this is how we're all going to encode and collaborate around these indicators of behavior chains and the threat actors. So that's kind of a really quick overview of what I see as some of the challenges and what we formed the IOB working group to try to address.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jason. Carter, how about from your perspective?
Hey, Harley. So I work for a company called NEA Systems, and we work in a pretty exotic sort of environment. We do autonomy for off-road vehicles, and there's a lot of uses for those, and a lot of people may not realize that there's a lot of non-human driving machines running around out there doing some interesting things. But because it's an exotic environment, there are not a lot of existing there's not a lot of threat intelligence information to share. And there's this impression that a lot of the attacks that we're going to see on not only autonomy, but in automotive scenarios, that they're going to be very unique and relatively new. And so I see that the STIX taxi is a great framework on which to add new additional indicators, but I think there's a whole family of next generation 0-day events that are going to occur with these new exotic platforms. And so I think it's going to compel us to extend STIX and taxi a bit to add new metrics, new descriptive metadata, and new techniques that we're going to discover that adversaries are going to use against these exotic platforms. And the interesting thing is with automotive cybersecurity, there's a huge safety impact. And so the need to assimilate intelligence that's usable and effective quickly, and then to distribute those very quickly to a large set of assets, it's a challenge. And STIX taxi wasn't really designed to get a message out that day to 1.5 million objects so that you can try to stop something that might spread. So while I don't anticipate that to happen in the next couple of days, but I think that we should prepare for those kinds of scenarios and make sure that our tools and our techniques can at least address that kind of a scenario pretty quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Carter. Yeah, your point about the safety aspect is interesting because I've been doing a lot of work in facility-related control systems and same type of problem, right? Those type of attacks have a great deal of safety ramifications and such to human life, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Charlie, how about your thoughts?
Well, the thing that really drove a lot of us here at the Applied Physics Lab to wanting to look for a different approach was, as you mentioned, Harley, we've done a lot of work in security automation and orchestration, and a lot of it's been focused around threat intel shared across the community. And the state of the art is mostly big buckets of atomic indicators of compromise. And by their very nature, that's very reactive. And we've had to, first we had to get the messaging out there that if you're going to respond to these things, you have to respond very quickly and help shape what very quickly meant. Because, in the dark old days, we had people looking for IP addresses of an adversary's command and control from some report based on an attack that happened 6 months ago. And we just kind of collectively ignored the fact that the adversary probably saw that public report too, and probably isn't still at that same address that he was at 6 months ago because the adversary is not stupid. And so we worked with how to speed that up. And we got, we've shown how you can get that down to minutes. But the problem is it still becomes whack-a-mole. It's trivial for an adversary to make a new IP address. It's trivial to make a new file hash. Trivial nowadays to stand up new domains and move around. And so if we don't want to just constantly be chasing after, the latest iteration in the past hour or minute of an attack, we needed something that's more repeatable. And that's when we started looking at analytics and saw that there's some great threat hunt folks out there doing some awesome analytics, but a lot of the focus was looking at, how do I make the most awesome detection for this observed moment of this threat actor doing these types of tricks. And you can get really good low false alarm analytics that way. But we started thinking, well, why don't we, instead of looking for how they're doing it, can we really look for what they're doing? And that's what led us to thinking of characterizing it as behavior. And as we started putting some ideas out on there, along with a lot of other great people, OCA began to stand up this group, and this looked like it's become a natural fit to find like-minded individuals like the folks we have here.
Great. Yep. Thanks, Charlie. And as we've talked in the past, right, some of the challenge with indicators of compromise, it just feels like we're chasing an infinite problem that we'll never kind of get in front of, right? Because the adversary can adapt so easily, makes me wonder, whether we're really having much of an impact against the adversary the way we're doing it today.
We definitely have an impact on our own ops. I mean, we've seen people struggling to keep up with that fire hose.
Yeah, exactly. So, maybe we take a step, and Charlie, I'll ask you to maybe address this. So, can you kind of describe for folks when we say indicator behavior, what do we actually mean? So, for folks that might not be familiar with that, what is an indicator of behavior? Sure.
So, an indicator of behavior is right now a machine readable object. We're using we're extending the STIC standard. So these are JSON object notation or JSON formatted files that represent, at the moment, adversary behaviors in a sequence. So that's going to be the repeatable steps of observed procedures. Rather than living at the tactic and technique level, we like to go one level a little bit deeper. And that sequence of procedures in the object is also linked to repeatable detections. So queries you could run on various types of logs to look for that behavior. Even though some of those might have a high false positive rate when it comes to detecting a threat, the IOB work also shares a correlation object to explain how we can design, either through human or ideally automation, in my opinion, we correlate alerts from these different detections to look for common fields. And so while I might not care deeply that a computer opened a web browser, I like being able to share an object that can be processed at machine speed that says, I do care when a machine opens a web browser, downloads a macro-enabled Office file, and within a few seconds of opening said file begins doing some shady stuff across the network. And helping to share, that's what we want to correlate across these fields. That's where we're using the JSON object to cover that. And we are working also on including ways to identify triggers for your different response actions so that we can work better with a lot of our other efforts going through the OCA and across the community in general for standardizing how we respond to threats.
Very good. Excellent. All right. Carter, a while back, I heard a presentation you gave, and you talked about, I'll say, 4 different types of behaviors that you felt were kind of important for folks to understand and be able to identify. Can you maybe talk a little bit about those 4 different types for folks?
Yeah. So the way I see indicators of behavior, where they're contributing the most is in anomaly detection. I think a lot of people have heard the term behavioral anomaly detection in cybersecurity for many years. And the concept of what is a behavior and how do you track behavior, identify it, is pretty complicated. But behavioral anomaly detection seems to be a very natural sort of a way to approach this problem of trying to describe behaviors and trying to indicate that this behavior may be malicious, or it may be adversarial, or may be a threat to an asset. So the kinds of behavioral anomaly detections that I think are critical to doing effective cybersecurity and information sharing for cybersecurity really evolves around the concept of new emergent behaviors. This is something that I see in my environment that I've never seen before. And when you see something that's brand new, you have to, if you're going to evaluate it from a cybersecurity perspective, you need to do an immediate threat risk assessment, realize, is this an attack or is this a threat to the system that you're trying to protect? And anomalous behavior, like I've mentioned, is all about divergent behavior, but it's an active process. I see a behavior that is different from what I'm expecting in an environment. And those two by themselves cover about 80% in my best estimate of all of the behaviors that we're expecting to evaluate and analyze in cybersecurity, or indicators of behavior for cybersecurity. But there are two others that I think are really even more important when you start to build a system around indicators of behavior, and that's missing behavior. The idea is that attacks have primary, secondary, and tertiary impacts on systems and on individual components. And a lot of times we use the lack of a polling indication in a network or a missing process in a component. And it's the missing behaviors that are not really don't have a slot in information sharing right now. And for me, all of these things require the ability to know that this is new or different or missing. You have to understand what normal behavior is. And we don't have in indicators of behavior or in any kind of sticks or taxi messaging capability, the ability to describe what are we expecting this asset to do in various different situations. And while being able to describe normal behavior doesn't necessarily yield to an immediate cybersecurity event, it is the foundation on which you can understand how is this thing that I'm experiencing or that I'm observing, how does it create a risk or a threat to an asset? So my biggest interest in IOBs is to try to capture the ability to describe normal behavior and then to be able to indicate these three different conditions against normal behavior and to provide enough metadata in there so that we can analyze it and maybe even share it very quickly so other assets can use that information. How's that, Harley? Does that
Yeah,
close?
that's good. Thanks, Carter.
Okay.
So, you mentioned, that normal behavior, right? So that's kind of like establishing a baseline of what normal is in an environment. That's not an easy thing to do, right? I mean, even in some well-defined environments, like maybe with an autonomous vehicle or in a control system, that's still challenging. And when you think about applying that in an IT environment, that's really can be very difficult. So it kind of brings me to my next question, which is, what do you see as kind of the biggest challenges with, I'll say, representing adversary behaviors and using those behaviors?
Are you asking me?
Yep. Yeah, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so the big challenges for what we do at NEA are really very specific threats to autonomous driving, or we're specializing in off-road autonomy, but it applies to just about any kind of driving conditions. And these devices are dependent on functions and mechanisms in order to even approach the notion of providing an autonomous driving capability. One of those is GPS spoofing, the idea that we are heavily relying on knowing where we are, what direction we're going into, and what speeds. And there isn't much in the literature or in the practice on how do we report on deviations in critical components that we are relying on to be able to do the mission or to be able to protect the asset. And so I think if you take a zero trust sort of architectural approach to these things, you start to look at the threats to an asset or to the data or to the service itself, rather than trying to say that too many packets are a bad thing or some kind of access control failure can lead to something. The idea is that you need to have more direct observations of actual functionality and to be able to understand the deviations away from that, to understand that there's potentially a malicious action going on against an asset. And that's challenging. It's incredibly challenging. I mentioned baselines. Just to know that you can establish a baseline kind of means you have identified the behavior. You know what it is that you're looking for so that you can have the metrics and the objects and all of the statistics that tell you this is what I'm expecting. And that to me is the biggest challenge.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Jason, how about your thoughts? What do you see as those biggest challenges?
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with what you were saying earlier, Harley, and to Carter's point, like defining normal behavior would certainly be quite challenging just because of the volume and how difficult it'd be to quantify all that and say this is the expected normal behavior for the system. It'll be, you know, that by itself would be quite challenging. In terms of codifying behavior for threat actors and sharing and collaborating around those, you know, so aside from the challenge that, you know, Charlie's been tackling, and how do we actually encode this, and how do we go and it was actually a great point that Charlie mentioned, you know, adding the detections as well, right? I think it's important for people to realize that, you know, we talk a lot of it in this working group about we want to share and collaborate on the behaviors, but the detections on how to detect those behaviors and what to actually go and look for to find them are just as important. And the whole aspect of how this work has tied all of that together in one nice concrete bundle. So here's what I'm looking for this threat actor. Here's the actual behavior. And here are the ways that you go and detect that behavior using open standards like Kestrel or Sigma, so that they work across all kinds of different products, and anybody can take and apply those. It really brings all the different pieces of the puzzle together in terms of what people need to collaborate around. In terms of challenges, you know, I think part of the challenge is a shift in mindset, right? So that's definitely one, is how do we get people to shift their mindset from indicators of compromise to indicators of behavior? The other challenge that I see, and I don't think we as an industry have really necessarily tackled this yet, is what is the forum by which, you know, once we have this format defined and agreed upon, what is the forum by which we can actually start to collaborate and share on these things? It's not as simple to me as say, oh, throw all this stuff up on GitHub. I think there's going to need to be a better way to do it. You know, the example I give, you know, to folks sometimes is whenever there's this new 0-day event, major news-making threat that's happening, and everyone's trying to deal with it, the only place that where does everyone go? You go on Twitter and see everyone just tweeting out, okay, you know, these are the IOCs I'm seeing, these are the things I'm seeing, here's the Sigma I'm working on, and it's just constantly changing, moving at lightning speed, and it's impossible to keep up on top of. But what else do we have? there's not really any better way to do it, and I think as an industry we need to figure out what the better way to do it is, you know, if we want to be able to scale this stuff to you know, be able to effectively defend against this. Like, what I would like to see is when one of these news-making 0-day headlines happens, you know, what typically happens in a major enterprise or MSSP is a war room type of environment gets created, right? Everybody kind of goes into that war room and starts talking about, okay, here's what we're doing, here's the things we've patched, here's the to-do action items, here's how we're reacting to that. But all these war rooms, you know, there are thousands and thousands of them happening in isolated bubbles all over the world during these events. How do they get connected together, right? So that we can collaborate more and have collective defense as opposed to isolated defense. And that to me is one of the biggest challenges that we have to solve as an industry over the next, you know, it's not something that's going to get solved overnight, but over the next, you know, 18, 24, 36 months, you know.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, that collective defense, you know, I've always been a big advocate of that. I often use an analogy of kind of the over the horizon radar, right? That's looking at something that maybe you can't see yet, but is coming your way, right? So and you bring up a really good point about the culture, right? I tend to think about the challenges in this space from a technical perspective at times and an implementation, but the culture of how we move into that is really important, because many people have built, companies and many organizations around the sharing of indicators of compromise. So, Charlie, how about you?
So, don't want to just pile on and repeat everything, but definitely there's some of the biggest challenges we're seeing is learning how to write, not just build the detections, but really rethink how we're looking at this problem. So trying to look for and without conflating words here, but when I want to represent what the adversary behavior looks like for a defense team, I need to also think about how I'm going to see my systems behaving and see what's going to be more repeatable. And so that leads back, as I harped again on the need to really get these correlations right, because the repeatable pattern isn't the name of the registry key. It isn't the executable file name. And it probably isn't even, a bunch of fuzzy hash rules for families of malware. The repeatable thing is the pattern of common data happening on the victims in the network. That representing that has been one of our biggest challenges as we are playing around with it. We have our reference implementation up and we have our little test labs where we emulate threat, but that's going to be a major challenge to work out across that whole community, because I liked Jason's characterization of the war rooms. We really see that we need to get to a route where especially the MSSPs and the cloud providers, where they can get some common ground to share and collaborate this stuff. And I think it has to be in a structured format. And it's part of the big reasons why we're such a big proponent of sticks is the format allows for the creation of environments where you can collaborate and modify this knowledge graph with attribution to who's doing what, so that you can rapidly transform and adapt this data to address these oncoming threats. And I think that's some of the biggest challenges we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree when you talked about the being able to correlate, right? I mean, that's I think an important concept and something we can't downplay in this, because a lot of times those behaviors can look like, a normal administrator behavior can look like threat activity if it's not correlated with other things happening within the environment, and you can't bring all those data elements together, right? And as you said, with the detection logic, if you're so specific to look for a very specific string within, say, a registry or something, all of a sudden you're just writing normal kind of AV rules, right? It's a signature, and I think that's really there's a fine line between being able to take these behaviors and have them detect them in a way that allows you to correlate those things together. So good points there. I'm going to jump to the Q&A. We have a question here about the indicators of behavior, tying indicators of behavior to MITRE ATT&CK, or is there a way of creating similar approaches to mappings of the manual creation of IOBs to a sticks package? So things like MITRE ATT&CK, defend, they seem to be addressing similar challenges. So how does what's being done with the indicators behavior project align with those efforts? I think Jason, maybe we'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, I can start, and then Charlie can get into the detail of how the mapping is done in the format. But suffice it to say, MITRE ATT&CK is a critical piece to this entire equation. And hopefully everyone's familiar with ATT&CK by this point. It's hard to imagine folks who aren't, so I'm not going to go into what MITRE ATT&CK is. The goal of IOB is definitely not to try to reinvent the wheel or recreate anything at all that ATT&CK is doing. It's more around for all of the different techniques that are in ATT&CK, right? And potentially techniques that haven't yet been added in some outlier scenarios, but most of the time they're already there. So first of all, you want to create that linkage and tag inside the data format, and STIX has the capability to do that. Thankfully, MITRE itself publishes ATT&CK in STIX. Actually, the system of record for ATT&CK is actually a STIX repository. So it makes it nice and easy to do those linkages. But what ATT&CK doesn't necessarily do or have right now, although there is a project called ATT&CK Flow that is somewhat related to this. For folks who aren't familiar with ATT&CK Flow, it's a project that came into the MITRE Center for Threat Informed Defense, and it describes ways to essentially have chains of attack procedures that happen over time. And, one of the things that I think, we do, the whole goal of all the projects in the OCA is to not reinvent wheels where they create, and we're all about collaboration. And I think that, some of the work that was done in IOB predated ATT&CK Flow, and then ATT&CK Flow came out, and we're going to try to figure out, how do these things work together? How do they mesh and meld together? But suffice it to say, ATT&CK Flow doesn't do everything that we're trying to do, or that has been covered in the current working group. But it's probably definitely a piece of something that we might want to try to align. Charlie, do you want to get into any more technical detail on that, or?
Absolutely. Well, one quick statement on ATT&CK, and then I'll have another follow-up with ATT&CK Flow, which I agree is doing some really impressive work. The key challenge we've seen is trying to switch between, pardon the expression, but switching between corporate speak and operator speak, because people like to say TTP altogether, and everything that talks about tactics and techniques must be TTPs. And that P, procedures, is kind of important, because if we could write detections for if we could write a master set of detections that worked for an entire adversary tactic, we definitely would have done that over the last 25 to 30 years. You have to be a little bit more specific, and MITRE ATT&CK is critical. And by the very definitions in that attack matrix, it's tactics and techniques. And we have to look at sequences of procedures. So it's critical to reference it. Our behaviors are all tagged with ATT&CK references. And it's also because that's going to give you your key pivot point. Because I might take APT XYZ, or whatever the latest one is today. And if I want to represent that campaign as a series of behaviors, they're going to pivot back to attack elements. But by having those connections and sharing it in a knowledge graph format like STIX allows, that gives us the ability to have this larger data ocean where I can say, hey, they're doing this sequence of procedures that lead to this sequence of techniques. And now I can pattern match and look for similar campaigns and start getting ideas about additional responses and courses of actions I might need to take once I observe one set of adversary behavior that might give me an idea of other things I should be looking for in my network. And so ATT&CK gives that critical pivot point to look across those elements. And the other thing I'll say quickly on ATT&CK Flow, we've been working closely with the Center for Threat Informed Defense. Shameless plug, they'll be speaking at our next IOB project meeting, open to the public. So if anybody here wants to see a lot about it, they'll be glad to share some stuff. But ATT&CK Flow is really taking those machine readable objects and helping provide that narrative in a way the human can follow. And we are looking at being able to support that, but also sharing the set of breadcrumbs and additional data that the machine can follow, because tying this into automation, I believe deeply, is critical, because the speed and scale of the cyber threat a fully manual response cannot ever scale to meet it. And so that's how I see these elements coming together.
Very good. So, so Charlie, you mentioned, what we're hoping to
Carter
accomplish.
has something. I believe Carter had something.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Carter.
Oh, I was just going to kind of fill in on some of the MITRE ATT&CK stuff. I've kind of been a critic of MITRE ATT&CK in the IOB working group because in some ways, it's a wonderful taxonomy. It has a great set of, if you can classify the behavior that you're seeing into one of these categories that MITRE ATT&CK describes, then you've got a great path to mitigation and further identification. So you can actually respond to that. But the key element for me, especially in vehicles, we don't expect to see lateral movement inside a vehicle. It's more like an industrial control system with a little bit of an IT sort of impingement into it. And so nobody expects the brakes to try to discover what the other components are in the vehicle. But we don't really expect there to be software resident inside a vehicle that doesn't know where it is. So the idea that it would do lateral movement in a vehicle seems pretty crazy already. So the more interesting part of the way I see MITRE ATT&CK and flow is that if you can get your behavior into this classification, you're well on your way to identifying, protecting, responding, recovering, all of the things that you need to do to deal with that problem. But knowing that I have a rogue piece of software running in this component of the vehicle, but it wasn't preceded by lateral movement, is in some ways more valuable, because you know that this guy has a very high level of awareness of where he is. The sophistication of the attack is up even higher up into the food chain because he didn't use generic methods to discover what was going on in the vehicle. So I think the MITRE ATT&CK framework is critical for classification, but it's when you see new behaviors, when you see things that aren't quite in the right order, when you see things that are a little bit out of the box, you need to provide as much metadata and information in your messaging so that you can, maybe the next time this is seen, you can finally classify it. You can finally realize later on, but you're not going to figure it out in real time if it's a brand new 0-day event. So just like Jason said, the STIX taxi framework, just making few additions to like metadata, contents, or a couple of additional objects, like what is the nature of the detector that saw this behavior, maybe all that we need to be able to do the learning later on and the correlation and the analytics to realize, oh, this is just some abstract lateral movement. We just never seen it before. And now we're in business again.
Yeah, good point. And I think it, as you mentioned, it kind of helps support that collaboration piece that Jason was talking about earlier, right? I may not be able to align it and classify it initially, but over time, through good collaboration and sharing, we can get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, Charlie. So, as the chair of the sub project, how are you looking, and what are you hoping will come out of the sub project that will help solve some of the challenges that we talked about a little bit ago?
So, a few things, and so I'll focus mostly on kind of in the very near term. But obviously, we're trying to incorporate the feedback from the project members on a reference implementation. And so one of the first things we want to do is, as we reach agreement on, we want to get agreement on what are the right types of objects and what's the minimum set of right types of objects to be adding or suggesting to add to STIX, and as well as extensions, so that we can then begin the more formal process of submitting those for consideration to the STIX technical committee. Because as extensions to a standard are great, but we'd also like them to be known across the greater community. So we'd like to get those incorporated, and we're working towards that. Additionally, we're looking for more opportunities to, either through kind of plug fests or different type of pilot efforts, to try out these concepts, because we can experiment in a lab all day long, but we really have to get our hands on some more operational data for the employments to show how this can work. And then, kind of like we're doing today, a very heavy outreach effort to build up support, because I do think that we need to get some greater participation in, especially in the MSSPs, vendor community, and the ISAC ISALs in order to really see this idea take off. But those are the main, if we get all those accomplished, then I'll think we did a pretty good job.
All right. So let me go over to Jason. So Jason, you participate in the sub project. What would you like to kind of see come out of this and see the project accomplish over the next, say, 2 to 4 years, right? What would be valuable to you that would come out of this work?
Yeah, so I mean, Charlie outlined some of the high-level goals. I think one of the tactical things that we're trying to get to is so we talked about what the group is working on and defining these extensions to sticks in a machine readable format that can be done at machine scale. For folks who aren't aware, the sticks standard has this process by which you can take a set of extensions and formalize it. And you can essentially say, this is our official, quote unquote, official extension to the stick standard. It's how we create and share IOBs. And it's published by the Open Cybersecurity Alliance. And anybody who's interested in doing this, any vendor who wants to support this, any ISAC or ISAL or MSSP who wants to support this, here's the way to do it. And here's how you go and get it. Here's the reference material. That to me is kind of the North Star of where we want to try to get with the working groups. How do we get that extension to the point that we're confident in it and published? I think the steps to get there's kind of 2 different steps, right? There's the technical side, but then as Charlie raised, there's the validation side, which is really important. Having more stakeholders come in and actually operationalize this stuff, because a standard that no one uses is just a piece of paper, right? Or in our case, a wiki page or whatever. And that is not what any of us wants. None of us wants to create this thing that no one uses. We want to get to the point of it being used. And in order for it to be used, we need support from the vendor community as well as the consumer community, to tell their vendors that this is important and that they want them to be involved in this work. So yeah, those to me that's the high level goal to me, is how do we get to that point where, I would like to be able to have an intelligence sharing group define a new adversary behavior, have that behavior be published in an ISAC sharing forum, and then have everybody who's a member of that ISAC be able to download that, and their tools are now all of a sudden looking for that behavior, all automatically. That's the North Star. That's where we need to get to. It's going to take time to get there. But that's, if we want to be able to do things at machine speed and keep up with the emerging threats, that's where we're trying to get to.
Very good. Carter, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I keep mentioning that the world that I'm working in now is kind of this exotic sort of world over here, but we really are leveraging off of a very large open source community called the Robotic Toolkit and the Robotic Operating System open source sort of community. And cybersecurity is relatively new in that community. For the most part, robotics has been more worried about trying to get the robotics to work rather than maturing it to the point where we actually start to protect it and assure that the robots are going to be able to do what they can do. So my desire is to bring sticks taxi messaging into the internal components of robotic systems, and so that we can make externalizing those and sharing those with other robotic programs a lot easier. And I sense that as an achievable goal in the next 2 to 3 years, because there's not a lot of cyber messaging within robotic systems today. And so it's a kind of a green field, and problems are starting to arise, and the communities are starting to get very interested in trying to find standard approaches to cybersecurity for robots. And so I think it's a really interesting opportunity to try to capture what's important to robots, automated systems, get them into some sticks taxi messaging, and then see if we can get this group, this industry, to embrace the whole ISAC sort of world that we've come to realize over the last 20, 30 years, how it's evolved and what the benefits are. So that's my big opportunity for, I think, the future. Let's get this into robots and then see if we can get a really interesting outcome out of this.
Yeah, and that kind of extends what Jason was talking about the ability to be able to automatically bring this stuff in, be able to immediately detect and respond to it, right? Without all that human intervention that tends to slow things down, because in these control systems, these autonomous systems, you don't have the human beings in there in that process, and it's too slow.
Right. Yeah. And I think Jason's got the vision in terms of the overall 50,000 million foot sort of thing. I'm kind of in the woods, in the weeds, I think, trying to figure out how do we get started, trying to just generate the first message. So,
yeah. Very good. Charlie, anything you want to add to that?
Just that, risk of sounding cheesy, just grateful to be able to, have avenues like the OCA that let all these great minds get together and collaborate on this effort, because it's just too big a challenge for any one organization, one person to figure out. And we need a lot more places like OCA that can make it this easy for folks to just drop in and start exchanging ideas and let that turn into actual product. So.
Well, and Charlie, that's a good lead into my my next question, right? So, so where do you post? How are you sharing information about the sub project and the work that's going on in the community? What kind of efforts are currently underway within the IOB sub project, and how do you share that information out with others?
Okay, so for those that are interested in finding more, the easiest way to start is to go to the Open Cybersecurity Alliance.org webpage, and you can scroll down and see the sub-projects and click on IOB, which will take you to our GitHub site. And GitHub is the main place we're using to share knowledge for things like a reference implementation, to see an example of what this means and some technical documentation behind that. You can pull that publicly available and play with it and give us feedback. But additionally, you can get information on how to join up to the project for free. And once you do that, you get access to our Slack channel, where we are sharing a lot of ideas all, across the world and around the clock. There's folks chiming in with different thoughts and good discussion going on there. And then you can attend the meetings, and the only risk involved is regular attendance leads to you being the lucky selectee sometimes to talk to the whole group. And as I think everybody here, I've suckered in at one point or another to have to speak to the whole group before. But that's how you can get started and see some of our next projects. We should have another revision of the reference implementation coming up soon. And there's also some early work we're doing on ontologies that, if anybody's interested, I know we have some members that would love to discuss that deeper and look at a more formalized way to represent some of that as well.
Well, Charlie, that's a great lead, and there's a question in the chat about that, right? So I'll read that. I'll let you address it first. There seem to be so many applications of behavior. So what are your thoughts about the use of ontologies to organize the type of information that fit into some of these structures?
So it's definitely, and I love to give Carter and Jason a chance to chime in too, but I do think that as we begin looking at the structure of how to represent the behaviors, some standardization of what we put in there, and like I said before, we'll leverage MITRE ATT&CK and other taxonomies to help use a common language as much as possible. But as we've already seen, the idea between, I tend to think of it heavily on detecting threat actors. Carter's got a lot of interesting more ICS style applications of how am I sharing what's observed to know when something not normal is happening. And we definitely need some work on there to more formalize and structure that so that we can know how we want, I don't know if classify has the right connotations, but how we classify the nature of these behavior sequences as well as detections and responses. And so that's how I see that playing out. Jason, Carter, love to get your thoughts.
Go ahead, Jason.
No, yeah, I think I agree. It's, you know, I think it'll be interesting over time trying to handle that use case of, you know, normal behavior versus abnormal behavior versus adversary behavior. It is an interesting twist. You know, I will be completely honest, when we started IOBs, like all we were all thinking about was adversary behavior. And then, you know, the idea of also tackling, you know, normal versus abnormal, it is an interesting pivot, and it is probably something that we need to consider, right? Because, you know, the world that I live in, the majority of detections are turning into be based on behavior and machine learning and, you know, abnormal detection. You know, there's you know, signature-based detection is always going to be there, especially for, you know, these zero-day things that crop up. But, you know, a lot of the stuff that you really need to capture and alert on, the way I put this to people is, if you're only looking for signatures, if you're only looking for Sigma rules, you're only looking for things you know about, right? And, you know, we all have to look for the, you know, the famous unknown unknowns. Like it's not enough to just look for the known unknowns. So it is an interesting pivot, but it is probably something we're going to need to work into the work stream, definitely. And maybe, you know, this whole idea of sharing, you know, normal, abnormal behavioral detection, it can actually get like so big, you know, that might be another eventual thing that the OCA tries to tackle, is how do we share, you know, how do we collaborate on machine learning type of detections, behavioral detections, because that goes into a whole interesting topic of, you know, I could talk about work that's going on in the Linux Foundation and other things that might be related to that, but those folks in the Linux Foundation aren't really thinking about it with a cybersecurity lens like we would be. So,
okay. So we have a question. Another question that came in is just to kind of bound the scope of the effort, right? So it was, is the IOB scope to focus on machine behaviors or human behaviors? So would prior efforts like to bring in modeling of cultural markers, things like that, be in or out of scope?
Go for it, Carter.
Go ahead, Carter.
Oh, yeah. So I think that the IOB scope should be on any kind of behavior. So in network anomaly detection, one of the big things that I've worked on over many years is the idea that classes of behavior should be in certain spaces. So in the control plane of a network, you should not see human behavior. In the, you know, so you shouldn't see somebody typing into the routing protocol ports in between two switches or two routers. And so that right there is a huge opportunity for IOB, keystroke detection in strange spaces. Now, how do you define what the space is? How do you indicate in the IOB that this detection is isolated to the control plane? And to me, that becomes the nitpicky little specifics that make this exercise so valuable. But I don't think that we should limit ourselves to any particular kinds of behaviors, but I do think we should focus on behaviors that we know to be adversarial, rather than going off and doing any kind of behavior that we can think of. Because if we go off and work on 15 or 20 different kinds of behaviors that are meaningless from a cybersecurity perspective, nobody's really going to pay any attention to this, you know, for very long. So I think that the ability to try to describe existing well understood behaviors and to elaborate on them through sticks and taxi is a great exercise, but we definitely should be interested in both machine behavior and human behavior, and be able to classify them in an intelligent sort of way so that it makes sense to the receiver, the guy who's reading your report, so they can put it in perspective. You know what I mean?
Yeah, good. Charlie, you were going to chime in on that.
Carter said everything better than better than what I was going to say, but I think it's a key part. I do think a lot of if you look at our early work, there's a lot right now looking at machine behavior because we needed to start somewhere. And that was, frankly, the easier part to start classifying is the observation on the machine. But,
all right.
So the one thing I'll add before we wrap up, Harley, is on this topic is the scope. So while the working groups and sub-projects in the OCA have scope, right? So the IOB sub-project has a charter. At the end of the day, the scope of the project is what the community makes it, right? So, you know, there's no grand poobah deciding the scope of what this sub project works on. Yes, there's a charter to guide the work, but you know, if the community decides that something is really important to do, then it'll get pursued. That's the whole nature of what we're trying to do with the OCA. So, sorry, go ahead, Harley. Didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I appreciate that. I think we're just about at our time, so you know, I'll just offer up you know, any last comments from anyone on the panel.
just
Twitter?
IOB project is open to the public. We want your help out there watching this, and come join us. We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and Charlie, I'll say, you know, one of the things, and just maybe a quick side question for you is, you talked about those detection objects, right? The ability to generate those detections. That's not something that one organization is going to do, in my view. You know, I think that needs to be a community effort, and something that needs to be pulled together as well too. So,
I agree fully.
Yeah, Carter, any comments?
No, I'm really happy we had an opportunity to talk about this. I hope we can attract a bunch more people into the group because I think it's a really interesting set of problems, next generation cyber problems. So I'm really excited about it.
Great. Jason?
No, I'm excited as well. Happy to be a part of this and support it any way that we can. So, and just to close it up, thanks to Charlie for all the great work that he puts into the group, and it's very much appreciated by myself and everyone else in the community. So,
all right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for participating today. It's I think been an enlightening discussion. I really appreciate having such thought leaders in this area as part of the discussion today. So, thank you. And with that, I think we're at our time, and that'll wrap things up for us. Thank you all.
Thank you.